Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the April 27th, 2023 Social Equity Working Group meeting. I'm going to call today's meeting to order at 10:03. Before we get started, I would like to ask today's interpreter, Nancy, to introduce themselves and walk through how to access our interpretation services for today's meeting.
Thank you. I will repeat the following message in English. Este es un aviso por parte del intérprete. Para hacer uso del servicio de interpretación, favor de desplazarse a la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom. Haga clic en el icono de interpretación que aparece como un globo terráqueo y seleccione Spanish o Español. Si está utilizando la aplicación de Zoom desde celular o tableta, presione los puntos suspensivos, luego Interpretation y luego el idioma. Si se ha unido a la reunión de hoy en la sala de juntas de SANDAG y necesita interpretación, por favor diríjase a la recepción del piso 7 y solicite un receptor. Este se parece a un pequeño iPod y se puede utilizar para escuchar la reunión en español. Solo sostenga el auricular junto a su oído y la interpretación comenzará automáticamente. To use the Zoom interpretation feature, please scroll to the bottom of the Zoom screen. Click on the interpretation icon that appears as a globe and select English or Spanish. If you are joining using the Zoom mobile app, please press the ellipsis, then interpretation, and then choose your language. If you're joining us today at SANDAG and need interpretation into Spanish, please check out a headset from the receptionist on the 7th floor. The headsets look like a little iPod and comes with an earpiece which you can use to hear the meeting in Spanish. Simply hold it to your ear and the interpreter will come on automatically. Thank you.
Thank you. Our chair, City of Carlsbad Mayor Pro Tem Priya Bat Patel, is unable to join us in person today, but is with us virtually. Clerk, can you please affirm that the chair is able to participate virtually?
Thank you, Chair Bat Patel. I need to ask you a couple of questions. If you could please state the reason for your remote participation.
Yes, it's a physical condition that doesn't allow me to participate in person.
Thank you. And can you confirm that you will be able to remain with your camera on and be able to participate when speaking, not muted?
Yes.
And that there is no one present in your location over the age of 18?
Yes, there's no one else present that over the age of 18.
Great, thank you. You meet the requirements legally to participate remotely.
Thank you, Clerk. Now I would like to pass it over to our chair, Bat Patel.
Great, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Before we begin with our agenda items, I'd like to go ahead and review the meeting process for both the working group members as well as members of the public who wish to participate. For working group members, when you'd like to speak, if you could please raise your hand, and I'll have Paula helping me call on you by name. And in front of you are iPads where you will find today's agenda and supporting materials by clicking on the arrow on the top left. Please note that you can zoom in and out using the iPad touchscreen. Clerk, can you provide a quick reminder on how the public comments will work for today?
Yes, if you are here in the room and would like to provide public comments, there are speaker slips in the back of the room. If you could complete one for the item that you would like to speak on and bring that to me. If you are virtual, please raise your virtual hand and you will be called upon by the name you have registered under or the phone number. We will take in-person public comments before we take virtual.
Great, thank you. Do any members of the working group have any questions on meeting procedures before we continue? Okay.
Excuse me, Chair. I would also like to state that because we have a member remote, that all votes must be taken on a roll call basis.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the clarification. And did we have anyone raise hands at all?
No,
I don't see any. Okay, great. So we'll go ahead and begin with item number 1, and that's going to be member and public comments. So if working group members would like to offer any comments or questions on items not on the agenda today, raise your hand at this time.
No hands, Chair.
Okay, great. And do we have any comments from the public on items not on today's agenda, Clerk?
There are no non-agenda public comments.
Great. All right, well then moving on to the next item. That is item number 2. We will proceed to approving the March 23rd working group meeting minutes. So if there are any comments or questions, you can raise your hand at this time. Okay, I'm not seeing any, but Paula, let me know if I'm missing anyone.
No hands.
Okay, great. Any comments from the public?
There are no public comments on this item.
Great. May I have a motion to approve?
Motion.
Carol, I make a motion, sorry.
I'll second it. This is Barrett.
Okay, great. So I think I heard, was it Carol for the motion and Barrett for the second?
Yes.
Okay, great. Those in favor, please. And I know we have to do a roll call, so I'll pass it off to the clerk to do the roll call.
Thank you. Bayside Community Center, Rose Ceballos. Aye. Casa Familiar, Goyo Ortiz.
Aye.
City Heights CDC, Jesse Ramirez.
Aye.
Chula Vista Community Collaborative, Omar Calleros.
Aye.
El Cajon Collaborative, Carol Lewis.
Aye.
Mid-City Can, Belen Hernandez.
Aye.
South Bay Community Services Corp, Rachel Martin, no.
More no? Yes. I'd like to sustain this. I was not here last meeting.
And Olivewood Gardens, Claire Grubner.
Aye.
Operation Samahan, Faye Seligman.
I would like to abstain because I was not here last meeting.
Urban Collaborative Project, Barry Pollard.
Aye.
And Vista Community Clinic, Carmela Munoz.
Aye.
Thank you. That motion passes with 2 abstentions.
Okay, great. So moving on to the next item, item number 3. And the February Joint Working Group Forum Summary Report has been completed and is posted to the SANDAG website on the 2025 Regional Plan webpage. And the report provides a summary of the forum itself, which many of you attended, along with the summarized feedback heard from the working groups, task force, and members of the public. In addition, a high-level summary of how the feedback is influencing the 2025 regional plan is included. As you all may know, SANDAG hosted a joint workshop last Friday with the California Department of Technology, Public Utilities Commission, and the Imperial Valley Economic Development Corporation to get feedback on barriers to get connected to the internet. The workshop had nearly 100 attendees, including community members and representatives from organizations working in digital equity. The feedback will help California develop the state's digital equity and broadband equity access and deployment of the 5-year action plans that will determine how federal dollars are being allocated to address digital inequities in each of our communities. Thank you to those of you who shared the information or had members from your organization attend. And lastly, thank you to everyone for the robust discussion on the draft budget. Last month, as an update, the draft budget will be taken to the Board of Directors in May for final approval. And once it's been approved, we'll invite the finance team to return to this group. If there are any other additional comments or questions from any of the working group members, I'd love to provide that opportunity at this time. And if you raise your hand, I know Paula will help me out.
No hands.
Okay. Any comments from the public at this time?
There are no public comments at this time.
Okay. All right. Moving right along then to the next item, item number 4. And we have Paul Lafarga from SANDAG, who will present the Regional Anti-Displacement Strategies Draft Best Practices Report. And I will go ahead and hand it over to Paul.
Thank you, Chair. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Paula Farga. I know many of you in the room today, and it's a pleasure to be back to address this group with an update on the anti-displacement strategy. I originally came to this group last fall to let you all know that the displacement strategy had just kicked off. We're working with Urban Displacement Project from UC Berkeley, LaSar Development Consultants, and their sister firm, Global Policy Leadership Academy. Since then, we've gained some momentum in informing the strategy. So I just wanted to touch base with you all today and share kind of the overall policy framework from the strategy. Looks like a new clicker for me. Cool. Okay. So good. Today's objectives. So I just wanted to engage with all of you on the best practices research. I also have a couple other objectives that I could hope that we could foster some better community understanding of these best practices. I hope that the service members in your areas could also be informed of this information and maybe talk to some of their local leaders as well about possibly adopting some of the anti-displacement policies as well. All right, so today's agenda. So I'll give a little bit of a brief introduction on displacement and the work itself. I'll go into the policy framework, talk about some different scenarios, and then I also have some questions I would like to ask you all. Okay, so I know that some of you are familiar with why we're doing this project, but I know that we have a new chair and we might have new members of the public tuning in today. So I just thought I would give you kind of a Cliff Notes version here. So this is from the 2021 regional plan. It's an implementation action from that plan, and the need came up during conversations with stakeholders involved in the 10 transit lifelines. They called out a need to understand the impacts of large transportation infrastructure on areas that are already facing displacement pressure. Additionally, as SANDAG's role in housing, we want to understand the regional needs of housing, and displacement is an important component of housing and is an important equity component as well. So that's why the work needed to be done. There's 3 deliverables with this strategy. We have the existing conditions assessment report, which is also, I try to make it a little bit more colloquial as the displacement data report that looks at live conditions of what's happening on the ground. Best practices research, and so this talks about all the policies that could be enacted in order to prevent displacement. And these 2 deliverables are informing the development of the anti-displacement toolkit. And really the idea behind that is to empower jurisdictions to be able to act on some of these policies and start to make a difference. And so today I want to focus on the best practice research, just to kind of set the stage of, what it contains, what is within the whole strategy, and then what I want to focus on today, because it kind of covers a lot. So how did we identify the best practices? Just to start off, no one community has truly solved the issue of displacement. It's really complicated. Here in San Diego or in areas with high prices, we definitely feel it more, but it's not an issue that's only being experienced in San Diego County. So we reviewed academic studies, we looked at regional case studies, and through this work, we identified 3 different types of policies that can prevent displacement. But a big takeaway is that none alone can really prevent displacement. We need to be looking at them all together in a holistic manner. I know this group is probably pretty familiar with what residential displacement is, so I won't spend too much time here, but it's a term that we use to describe when existing residents have to move for reasons that are outside of their control. On the right-hand side, you can see kind of the different driving factors that we considered as part of the strategy. We hear eviction and foreclosure a lot, revitalization efforts. That kind of ties into large transportation investments, so that's the consideration there. And then we also looked at a residential displacement as being either involuntary or forced. And so here I want to talk a little bit more about the different types of residential displacement and what we mean by it. On the left-hand side, you can see the different causes: exclusion, indirect or economic, direct or physical. And then on the kind of upper top there, we see when I talked about the forced and the responsive. So I'll go through to give you some examples of what forced and direct might look like. We hear of eviction filing. That's pretty common. It's maybe one of the first things we think about. We also have condo conversions for the indirect or economic and forced. This is something we hear from the community a lot as well. And then when we have exclusion and force, we hear about maybe landlords unwilling to provide housing to people with Section 8 vouchers. And then we talk about houses physically deteriorating and becoming off the market that way. Also severe rent increases, as with the economic, and another responsive, people have to leave because prices go up. And then maybe the community just looks like nothing like you know it anymore. You don't have the same networks, you don't have the same support system. So then you go elsewhere to find that support that you had. So I mentioned this earlier, but kind of the main key takeaway here is that a variety of approaches are needed to prevent residential displacement. We can't just focus on one of these. We need to be thinking about them all together. And so the next slide has a Venn diagram that kind of shows what we're talking about here. So you can see different scenarios here, and this goes into our policy framework about talking about scenario planning. So if you have one hypothetical community that only focuses on producing more houses, how is that going to look? If you have one that just focuses on preserving, how might that look? And then one that focuses on just keeping residents in place with neighborhood and resident stability. And then the fourth, where we're looking at in between, looks at how these policies would come together and interact to be an effective anti-displacement strategy. So now I'm going to go through some of these strategies and talk about how it might look, the benefits and the drawbacks, and I'll go through each strategy. And then after that, I'll bring us back to what those policies might actually look like. The report that I attach as part of the agenda goes into a lot more detail about this. So I'm trying to deliver the most information without going a little overboard here, but I'll also highlight some of those policies as well. Okay, so scenario one, this is where we just prioritize production. So we can see that this initial hypothetical community that only prioritizes affordable and market rate housing. In this community, incentives, subsidies, and regulations would only really be directed towards new housing production. So while we pull one lever of increasing housing production, we see some beneficial outcomes, but we also see some drawbacks as well. So as far as the benefits, we see increased housing production. This helps meet the region's demand for housing and might help stabilize prices, creates more affordability in the region by helping to make some of that market equilibrium. Increased upzoning allows previously exclusive areas to help desegregate and unlock more land for dense housing production. So that sounds nice, but what about some of the drawbacks? So the drawbacks, the market's going to continuously respond to these existing economic conditions, and the affordable housing projects could quickly become not classified as affordable and converted to market rate units. This drives housing development and tenant costs higher every year, and it can force people out of their homes. Another drawback is that investors could continue to buy up a lot of areas of existing land to create high cost developments, and it might make the community look more of like a hotel than like a community, people coming and going so often. You'd lose some of that social cohesion there. And then with that, gentrification would be really pervasive. Also, this would create a drive till you qualify. And we know that reinforces cycle of poverty. It doesn't help us meet our climate goals, and considerable rent increases. And we know that that's a big issue of displacement today. So another scenario, this would be a hypothetical community that only looks at preservation, and public investment in housing is directed towards continuing existing affordability covenants and bringing additional units into this restriction. So while we pull the lever of preserving affordable housing, we see some benefits, and we also see some drawbacks as well. Benefits, existing low-income renters would be able to remain in place, and even if those residents' wages would rise later on, they would still be able to stay. People who own their homes do not feel pressure to cash out or sell with windfalls. And so the homeowner wouldn't see a large profit, so there wouldn't be as much of an incentive to sell the home. Also, existing homes would be made more environmentally sustainable. We would have weatherization improvements, things that would help in the cold weather, meet our climate goals. So some of the drawbacks, people would likely remain in their place due to limited housing options. And as a result, few homes would ever become available to buy or for new families to move into. One's home would essentially be theirs for life, whether or not they want to find somewhere else to live. And this could also lead to children not being able to find homes of their own when they get older. It could increase overburden households with more generations living together because there are no other options. And additionally, it might come at a big cost to the public sector because they would have to compensate property owners for taking on these price and home value restrictions. So it'd be kind of a bigger cost to society. Developers might see little incentive to create new housing, and they find it challenging to do so in existing urban areas where longtime residents have lived there. Properties don't become available for new housing, and any new housing that's built would come at a considerable cost, and it's likely that it would be pushed out to the urban periphery or in areas that already experience high air pollution, and it would just result in more urban sprawl. And so this would be the situation where we're just imagining a community that prioritizes people staying in place, and it places heavy emphasis on tenant protections, and it increases heavy subsidies for rental and homeownership assistance, foreclosure prevention. So all of that to try to keep people in place. And that sounds nice. We would see some benefits, which would be great that existing and low modern income renters would be able to remain in place without financial hardships from rent spikes. Fewer residents would be cost burden. We would have less eviction threats. Investors would have little incentive to own and operate rental housing, and that would keep the resale prices lower. And more residents who live in areas of high natural disaster risk would be better insured, and they might be able to stay in place if there was a future disaster. That also has a potential drawback that I'll mention in a moment as well. So that sounded great, but there would be little incentive for landlords to renovate units. And so with that, the units could eventually deteriorate, and they wouldn't be able to qualify for the HCV voucher program. And eventually more houses would just come off the market, and that wouldn't help with the displacement pressures. Limited housing production may create greater supply and demand imbalance, and might probably cause significantly higher land and housing costs. Even with financial assistance, it's unsure how many homes would be affordable for those that don't have existing home ownership. And I mentioned the insurance portion. It would be good because people could stay in place, but it might be bad in the sense that it would incentivize people to remain in areas that are at high risk of wildfire or flood, and those costs would eventually be passed on to society. Okay, so here are the three scenarios of how it might look like if we just focus on one area. So now I want to talk about what some of those policies might look like. And so we're back to scenario one, where we're just talking about, okay, let's build more homes. And ADU incentives are a popular way to do that. Increasing affordable housing funding. We talk about transit-oriented development a lot. Upzoning. If you refer to the report, it goes more into detail about what exactly these policies are and if it's a short-term or a long-term solution. But here are some of the policies that jurisdictions could adopt to prioritize production. If jurisdictions wanted to prioritize preservation, look for some policies that would do that. Community land trust, looking at you, San Ysidro, local or regional preservation staff. We see some of these developing in San Diego County already. Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. If they decide to sell the condo, then the tenant would have the first opportunity to purchase that. So there are ways that we could prioritize people, prioritize housing staying on the market. And then the last one of stability prioritize, we hear this a lot right now about tenant eviction programs, rent stabilization. These seems to be a big focus on anti-displacement policies right now in the San Diego region. So now I talked about what some of those policies might mean. Let's kind of take a full circle and look at the last scenario of where we're, prioritizing each, and we're adopting policies that support production, preservation, and stability as well. And so in this one, we're pulling all three levers. And so this hypothetical community would have an abundant supply of new housing units to meet the needs of a growing population. It would have policies that would preserve affordability through long-term commitments to price restrictions. We would have active tenant protections that would safeguard vulnerable residents from price shocks that lead to forced moves. And these policies would have both short and long-term solutions to meet displacement pressures. So these were the different scenarios that we came in mind of how it could look like if jurisdictions just focus on one or the other, or how it looks like if they all came together. I would encourage you to check out the report to get a better understanding of how each of these policies could look. But this was kind of a way of taking a lot of information into a shorter presentation. So as far as presentation materials, that's what I have, but I would like to now have some reflection questions. It's okay if I move on to those, Chair?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so I have a few questions, and these will help also informing our toolkit as well on how we design that to provide the local jurisdictions with material to do this. So I put up a few questions here. If any of them stick out to you, go ahead, or if there's something else you want to touch on you think is important, but I was curious about how you think we can ensure these strategies are utilized to prevent displacement and to create stability. So how can we act on these?
Hi, this is Barrett. I am turned on. First question, or not a question, but an answer is, we're asking them to utilize the scenarios that we outlined, right? The last one, all three of them. Is there any incentives for them to do this? Developers aren't going to necessarily jump right on board, and if it interferes with their plan, maybe a little incentives to sort of guide them into the right direction.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea. I hadn't totally considered that yet, but that's something I can take back to the consultants, and we can think about how we weave that into the toolkit.
And it's presently, there's some that's tied to like new market tax credits with, the funders, and that's normally where these are interjected in the policy.
Thank you. Okay.
Hi, thank you, Paul, for this very nice, very informative anti-displacement strategy. I was just thinking, and I remembered what my grandfather told me about land utilization. He said that if you don't own the land, you don't own the property. So in my thinking, I think we need to also address land utilization at its full value, because basically it's the driving force of any decision making that we do on housing. It's how you use the land, the scarcity of land, and what kind of houses you would like to put in that land that will generate income for the developers or for anyone who might want to use that land. So I read the proposal, and there's several structures that are already in place, such as land trust, land bank. And I think we need to explore that in deeper sense and tie it up with public housing. So in my mind, we have just touched the surface, which I think it's beautiful because this topic has not been addressed before, but we have not been digging deeper into what's really driving the pricing of houses. It's really land utilization. And if we focus on land utilization along with public housing, I think we can accomplish a lot. That's just my 2 cents.
Thank you. Goyo?
Yep. Thanks, Paul, for that presentation and opening up this discussion. CASA has been working on community land trust housing. And so we've played out a lot of the scenarios in a way. And we're taking a lot of cues from the state's community land trust network that exists. And there's a lot of innovative housing, community-led housing strategies up just in LA, city of LA, on really incentivizing government-owned land to community-led projects on housing. So I agree with Faye on really exploring the possibilities of real stability, right? Where you take away that the speculative market sometimes. In all of the scenarios you showed, yes, incentivizing housing, we need it, we need housing, but that comes at a price as well for older communities. So that needs to be explored. You referenced Topas and Elantra. So what else, or how can those be explored further? I think that's something worth to everybody here to explore those possibilities and really incentivize and incorporate more community into the development of housing and stability, long-term stability.
Thanks, Goyo.
Claire, was your hand up? Okay.
Thank you, Paul, for that presentation. I have a couple questions. I don't know that they
Sure,
address
go.
the reflection
Yeah.
questions, but one thing that that we see in National City, and I know other smaller jurisdictions, is that there's not a lot of resources or even capacity within our small government to, move forward some of these strategies. And so I wonder, what sort of role SANDAG plays or can play in helping, some of these smaller jurisdictions. And actually, we have so many different priorities. How do we get resources to do this, this work? So that's one question, I guess, or comment. And then the other one is around unused private land that's, just sitting. A lot of those spaces are brownfields. So an idea is, how do we collaborate with like the EPA brownfields program, which helps to revitalize these spaces, and what's the role of local jurisdictions in accessing that program, in working with private landowners who maybe aren't even in the community, are maybe not accessible. Like, how do we take advantage of all these spaces around our community that are just sitting for decades to move forward some of these strategies? So just comments maybe.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for your questions. I can start with the first one about how can we bring along some of these jurisdictions. I didn't get into as much detail, but this also ties into our housing acceleration program. And with that program, we provide local jurisdiction assistance as well. So as we're moving more forward in this, we're going to be meeting with the different jurisdictions through that program and engaging with them to develop the toolkit to see how it could be most actionable for them as well. So we will be coordinating. I think that some of our program staff also is in communication with some different elected officials from different cities. So we are closely coordinating on housing issues. And so this is a way that we're going to integrate those together. As far as your second question of how do we take advantage of these brown spaces, communities, and move forward, I think that's a great topic that we can talk to the jurisdictions about in this in the assistance. And I haven't quite thought about that, so that's something else that I can take to the consultant and see how we can consider into the strategy as well. Thank you.
Paul, could I just add one thing
Please.
To your first question? One of the other things that we've talked about with the jurisdictions and something that Paul will be bringing back when we get to developing the toolkit is that not only working through the TA program to work with the jurisdictions on how they can implement the policies, but Paul and the team are really looking at different typologies. So understanding that the toolkit shouldn't be a one size fits all, but really looking at how we can create a toolkit that looks different for maybe smaller communities in South Bay versus larger cities like the city of San Diego versus East County, North County. So we are taking into consideration the, diversity of our region and the makeup of our region. And then something else that we're hoping to be able to weave into the toolkit is really like identifying what are the low-hanging fruit that maybe are like the least politically challenging, might be easiest to like implement and start building support and consensus around the different strategies that would be in there. So that's kind of the vision for where Paul and the team are going to be able to help each of the jurisdictions at the different levels that they're at.
Can I just add one more thing too? So toolkits are great, but if cities don't have the resources to implement tools from the toolkit, then it's not particularly helpful. So another piece of that housing acceleration program is grants for local jurisdictions. So you've probably heard a lot about the REAP
1.0, 2.0, and then the call for projects that'll be coming out in May. So really quickly to be able to provide some resources to help with implementing these policies.
Thanks for giving those bigger perspectives as well.
Anyone else? Rachel?
Yes. Hi, Paul. Thank you so much. I just had one question and I know I'm sitting in for my other directors at this time, but don't know if this has been addressed, but if there's staffing support also to monitor some of these strategies. So I'm thinking with, as what Barry was talking about with developers, incentivizing developers. And we've seen this, right, where they have a certain percentage of Section 8, but then that rent still goes up with all these renovations and homeowners with the incentives to be able to preserve or stabilize their units. Who will monitor that once they receive this incentive to renovate their space, that they're keeping their tenants at the rate that they came in, you know, and really that education around it. And that's, I think, the piece, because eventually they will get pushed out once you have a nice, bright, shiny home.
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely an important consideration to make this sustainable as well. So thank you.
Carol?
There was one that really jumped out at me, and it was condominium conversions. But there's lots of bills now coming out to incentivize homeowners or home buyers instead of renters. And so with all of those new incentives coming out, you know, for those with low credit scores or some of these other bills that are coming out, how are we going to balance that with those condominium conversions? Because I think we'll see a lot of those apartments owners wanting to convert those to help those families get into some kind of home buying program.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We've seen some programs through the report that talked about when condos are sold to set up programs to where the tenants have the first right to purchase those programs, but you need funding, right, in order to make that happen. So that is a consideration, but there exists that funding gap as well. So thanks for bringing that up.
Anyone else? Belen and then Barry?
So I'm not an expert on housing, right? But I think one big factor when investors make decisions is like tax strategies and like state policy, right? So I'm just curious about how all of that is incorporated into the study, whether those tax policies are there to, you know, incentivize investors to invest more or invest less in a way that maximizes housing affordability, accessibility, but, you know.
Yeah, that is a really good point. And I know that in the report, we did mention about taxes and some of those investments and incentives. I'm going to have to reach out to you afterwards to kind of fill that, because I can't think off the top of my head. But
yeah, no worries. I don't need answers today. It's just something we should be thinking about.
Agreed. Okay, thank you.
Paul, maybe adding to your list of talking about balance and we're talking about the future of these communities as well. What's our communities going to look like in 5 and 10 years from now? Looking at zoning as a mechanism to sort of direct what type of housing goes where in the communities would probably make sense to sort of set the threshold of where they can put townhouses or apartments or single family, or in my case, my interest is in commercial and businesses. Because those zoning areas are going to have to change based upon this sudden influx of a lot of housing. And I don't see many people keeping their eye on that. And I'm just afraid that we may have some, what do they call them? Unintentional consequences down the road, right?
Right.
So maybe starting at that zoning aspect, that might give people a 30,000 foot level of what their community will look like. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I appreciate that. We do talk about upzoning as a way of being able to kind of choose an area and then be able to increase the density there. But I'm not sure we've considered the commercial and the business aspect of it as well. So I appreciate that consideration.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Another kind of question, I guess, about the toolkit is if it will have kind of like phased strategies, because, some of these are long-term. They won't help out people who are getting displaced right now. So if there's strategies that jurisdictions can implement right now to support people now with that long-term vision of, let's start with these 5 strategies, knowing that in 3 years, we're working towards these.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's kind of exactly where we're trying to go with that. I'll come back later on when we have some of the toolkit a little bit more better designed and fleshed out to share with you. But Tori mentioned some of those typologies. So that's something that we're considering as, okay, what are the lowest hanging fruits that some of the jurisdictions could knock out at once, and just considering that in our typologies of communities as well.
I'm sorry if I missed it, but when will the toolkit be completed?
Sure. So when the toolkit's completed, the whole strategy will pretty much be at its conclusion. So this is scheduled to end in January of 2024. Right now, we've completed the draft deliverables of the first 2 of the existing conditions and the best practice. We've been doing community outreach. We've had several focus groups, and we're planning on having more focus groups as well on some of the more deliverables. But we'll be spending a big part of the summer into the early fall designing the toolkit, meeting with jurisdictions, meeting with community groups, meeting with groups like this as well. So we'll probably see in the fall, more or less, what it's starting to look like. And then by January 2024, it'll be complete.
That makes a lot of sense. And I would echo what Barry said. I think visuals are very important. So whether this is being conducted in-house, correct, this study? Or is it?
Sorry, I missed that first part.
So just to clarify, the study is being conducted in-house or it's like a consultant?
So we have a consultant team. SANDAG is taking the lead on it, but we partnered with LaSar Development Consultants, and they have a separate consultant team with UC Berkeley's Urban Displacement Project. They helped with the data of the existing conditions report. GPLA has been helping with some of the stakeholder outreach, but this is like a SANDAG project, but we all working with the community, with the consultant team on it.
Understood. And I'm sure they have some kind of capacity on creating graphics. I think visuals are really important,
Visuals.
or those
Okay.
story maps as well, so people can see the vision of what housing can look like in their community.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to go back to land utilization. So when you were drafting this, did you also consider competition of land versus, let's say, agriculture, transportation, housing, and all those very messy factors into play? Because that will play a lot when planning for a strategy for a stable housing plan.
Not sure when we were developing it how much we were thinking about that, but we were thinking about kind of the existing parameters of where we are able to buy housing and what different land use tools that we do have in order to kind of modify those.
But I think also, maybe Faye, to your point, is that what we have recognized is that there is a lot of competition, and the competition, whether it is new development coming in, that's like housing or other type of retail, commercial, or transportation projects that come in, and you're right, even thinking from an agricultural perspective, all of these things can be factors that should be influenced in terms of displacement. And I think that's one of the things when the study was brought forward, is that we didn't want to think, in a singular scope, where we as SANDAG also want to recognize where our part is in it, because we do build a lot of major transportation projects in the region, and we need to understand its impact on a community and the displacement that it could cause. So I mean, I think, Paul, we can maybe go back and look at how we explicitly spell that out and the different influencers to displacement, but that was the nexus in the beginning when we were thinking about it. But we did think about it primarily from like wanting to make sure we called out transportation in addition to land use, but we'll add ag to that.
I just didn't want to add more work to your plate. So it's just a
We're here to
suggestion.
make
I'll
this
bring it
better.
up
So
with the-
yeah, no, thank you for that. That's something I hadn't considered, the agriculture piece. So thank you.
Other comments?
I think that concludes my, we got Claire, okay. I think we got another, Claire.
Yes, just one more. When thinking about how do we ensure that these strategies are utilized, I think about as Tori kind of mentioned, what's more or less politically charged. I think it's important to have like I don't know, your canned answers or whatever around like pushback on different policies. You know, a lot of times we hear, well, if there's not the economic development side is prioritized over anything else. And so kind of having, some answers to questions around, well, why would we choose this strategy if we see a potentially negative impact? I think if we can paint that bigger picture of, well, these are the other things that will happen as a result. I think we see it right now. So yeah, that's just another.
Great, thank you. No, that's helpful of helping to contextualize that, like drawbacks and benefits, and it's still important. So, okay. And I think that concludes my presentation, Chair.
Great, thank you. And great questions and robust discussion. And I want to make sure I know before we move on to public comment, if there's anything else that any of the board members would like to add at this time. Okay. Seeing none. Do we have any comments from the public?
I have one virtual commenter, Kim Heinley, please go ahead.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you very much for the moment to speak. I wanted to just say thank you for putting this report together. I think this is incredibly important. The work we do in Linda Vista, we see displacement all the time. It's a constant turnover in our neighborhoods. So I think this approach and the holistic approach, as you said, Paul, is really needed for this. It's not a one size fits all solution. So I like this layered approach that we have and that we're putting together. I just wanted to comment on two things. So in particular, most of this stems from the work we're doing in Linda Vista, and I sit on the planning group in our neighborhood and chair the Affordable Housing Task Force there. And I think it's really important to have that first right to return put into place if possible, so that when developments do happen, residents do have the option to come back first if they are displaced. We saw a very positive example of this in action with a development that was opened in January of this year with Community Housing Works. And when they came in back in like 2016 or 17 to get community approval for the project, the planning group pushed back and said, we want first right of return for the residents who are being displaced because of this. And they wrote that in as part of the agreement with the neighborhood. So I think that's a really good model. And I know it's not unique, but it doesn't happen enough. So I think that's something that we should be highlighting for sure in this. Also, I know that this is not exactly anti-displacement, but the fact that we know people will be displaced, I think you're right, Paul, again, with the holistic approach. One thing that the Linda Vista Planning Group has advocated for has been an increase in the percentage of inclusionary housing for the low and middle income housing in new developments. And I think that's something I would propose that we continue to push for. So I think currently the inclusionary housing rate is 10%. And that had been slashed, so it's only being built back up to 10%. The planning group had advocated for a couple projects along Marina Corridor and the Riverwalk to move it to 15% low income and 15% middle income. And that's some work that we're continuing to try to push forward, so at least there's a greater percentage of units available for low and mid-income housing. So when people are displaced, they still have more of an option of place to land on their feet. And that's all the comments I have. Thank you very much, Chair.
Great, thank you. And that was our only public comment.
Yes, that concludes the public comments.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we didn't leave anyone out. Thank you. Okay, so thanks again for the presentation, and we'll go ahead and move on to the next item. And we will now hear an informational update on the agency's transportation safety work presented by SANDAG's Sam Sanford and Chelsea De Leon.
Good morning, Chair, and good morning, Working Group. Thanks for having us back again. So my name is Sam Sanford from the Planning section, and I'm joined today by my colleague Chelsea De Leon, one of our wonderful interns helping out with this exciting project on a very different topic. So traffic safety or transportation safety. The last time we came to this group to provide an update was just about a year ago, I think just shy of a year ago. And at that point, we were looking at best practices at agencies like SANDAG, metropolitan planning organizations across the nation, and what they do in the realm of safety. And we showcased some of that work and what we aspired to do. One of those was to be seeking funding to advance some additional planning. Some of the ideas that came from this group were, we shared some of the ties with social equity and how there is a disproportional impact on traffic safety for low-income and historically disadvantaged communities. And we had some national statistics on that. And one of the requests was, wouldn't it be nice if we had some information about the San Diego region on a similar vein? And today we're able to talk about some of the efforts that we're starting right now that'll get us to that point. We do have a new clicker. Yes. Thank you. There we go. So at that last meeting was actually in June of 2022 when we came to this group and provided a brief update. And at that point, we're mentioning different funding options that we're going to be applying to. And we're happy to unveil today and that we did receive $2.5 million of discretionary federal funds. This is from a new federal safety program called Safe Streets and Roads for All. It often goes by its little acronym SS4A. You can see often in news or other headlines. But this is really going to allow us to develop an action plan, a Vision Zero action plan to be specific, that'll get us to the point where we have a prioritized list of concrete steps on how to improve safety in our region. And we do have 3 very important partners in this grant. We have Caltrans, who stepped up in a big way and provided resources and in-kind match to leverage federal dollars and bring more federal dollars into our region to support this. We also partnered with the city of Vista, so a small to medium-sized city, and the La Jolla Band of Luiseño Indians in North County Inland. And this way we are able to develop a regional plan that looks at the transportation network, regardless of ownership, but at a very high level. And then we have an example of a local city safety plan and one of our tribal partners' safety plans. And we see this as a model that then could be replicated elsewhere and then furthered in our region as well, where other cities and tribes want to develop similar planning efforts. That's a little bit of background about where we're at. I guess I should add that just this February, the SANDAG Board of Directors did take the action of formally accepting the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant funds. So now that's a process that's been complete. And we'll talk about next steps at the end, but I wanted to pass it on to Chesley, and she'll go into more detail about the grant and the plan development elements.
So a requirement of the SS4A grant is that an action plan must implement a safe system approach. And a safe system approach is how we achieve our goal of reducing the number of fatal and serious crashes to 0. And some of the founding principles of this approach are that safety is proactive and redundancy is crucial. Therefore, it focuses on these 5 elements that together create a holistic and inclusive approach with layers of protection for all road users. Safe road users means that the plan will identify regional policies and safety solutions to allow all users, including those who walk, bike, ride transit, drive, and travel by other modes to safely traverse within the region. Safe roads means that the plan will identify road designs that can reduce the severity and frequency of crashes by identifying proven safety countermeasures that address regional collisional hotspots and trends. Safe vehicles means that the plan will identify potential technology to utilize throughout the region that will minimize the severity and occurrence of collisions between all vehicle types. Safe speeds means the plan will identify traffic calming solutions and educational campaigns to reduce the impact of speed. And lastly, post-crash care means the plan will coordinate with traffic incident management operators and increase awareness of resources for crash victims. And with the safe system approach in mind, these are some of the key elements that we anticipate to accomplish from our regional Vision Zero action plan. First of all, we want to ensure that the plan and its recommendations are informed by the region's road users. Therefore, the development of the plan will be guided by a technical advisory group that will be made up of individuals with diverse backgrounds and disciplines, such as representatives from local jurisdictions and tribal nations, advocacy groups for safety and active transportation, health professionals, first responders, and school districts. And also, we will be coordinating outreach with you all, our community-based organizations, to engage with historically disadvantaged communities. The plan will also define a high injury network that will identify where safety enhancements are needed the most. It's a recurring pattern in data across regions and localities that a high percentage of collisions are occurring on only a small percentage of roadways. For example, LA County determined that 50% of fatal and serious crashes occurred on only about 4% of their roadways. So we want to identify where this is happening in our region, what are the primary causal factors for these collisions, and who are the most impacted. Additionally, we want to identify data gaps because there are currently gaps in mapping where these crashes occur, and there's also lacking data in rural and tribal areas. The plan will not only recommend projects, but policies that SANDAG and local agencies can incorporate into their processes, procedures, and programs. And lastly, we want to support our regional partners in addressing their own safety efforts. And with the work done by our grant partners, the City of Vista and the La Jolla Band of Luiseño Indians, we will produce templates that our local jurisdictions and tribal nations can use as a framework for their own plans. And to support the plan's development and its performance monitoring, we will be using a regional safety dashboard that is currently under development and is anticipated to be public this summer. The dashboard uses 15 years worth of demographic, network, and crash data to show safety trends across the region, and it will continue to evolve and update after it's publicly launched. The dashboard will provide the public with transparency when it comes to how the region is performing on safety prior to and after the development of this plan. And also, it will be a beneficial resource for local agencies to be able to easily find data and begin their own safety plans and efforts. And now I'll turn it back over to Sam to discuss next steps.
Looking forward to the next step. Thank you for the reminder. Looking at next steps, we're continuing our coordination with our grant partner, Federal Highway Administration, in executing the grant agreement. So this is a brand new grant program. It was initiated and first managed by U.S. Department of Transportation. They've now given it to one of their administrations, the Federal Highway Administration, to oversee this. There were over 400 recipients or 500 recipients across the nation. So Federal Highway Administration is gearing up to manage this new program that has a 5-year lifespan, and will have 5 cycles on it. So it's taking a little bit longer than we were hoping, but we're working with that grantor to get the documents in order and get everything executed so we can actually get work going in earnest on this project. Following that, we have an anticipated plan completion date of summer 2024. And that's really a critical deadline for us because there are 2 capital grant opportunities that follow shortly after that. And really much of the reason we are looking at this type of plan is because it will qualify the region to then apply for capital grants, implementation grants, things that we can actually use to update intersections, roadways, apply countermeasures, and those come and have essentially their application windows in that same time frame. So we want to make sure that we have a finalized, approved plan by that time. And then we'll also be looking at the integration of the data and the recommendations into the next regional plan, which will be our 2025 regional plan. And since we're talking about safety and all things on our roadway, I do want to give a plug for May as our bike month and lots of opportunities for activities. We do have the Bike Anywhere Day, which is May 18th. So we used to have a bike to work, but now many of us are working in different locations, we can bike anywhere, whether it's, take the kids to get ice cream just around the neighborhood, enjoy one of the new facilities that's been developed or opened in the last year or two. It's fun for all. There's also going to be events hosted by SANDAG. There's lots of partner agencies as well. There is a May 9th webinar that will go over some of the new facilities within our region and also some tips and tricks for recommendation. So with that, I conclude our report and have to turn it back over for any questions or comments.
Great, thank you for the presentation. And I'd like to go ahead and see if there are any comments or questions from the working group at this time.
Claire, did I see you wanting to say something? Okay.
I was wondering, you mentioned that part of this will be to develop some sort of educational campaign. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about that. I imagine I'm not the only one who has experienced kind of an increase in like road rage and unsafe behaviors on the road. So I'm curious what that will look like, if you know.
Yeah, more to come once we have a better understanding of the data and the analysis, and we'll be bringing a consultant on to help with that, as well as working with Caltrans and the other partners I highlighted in the presentation. But once we have a better handle of what some of the challenge areas are for our region and specifically, intuitively, we can talk about the ones that we see as excessive speed, for instance, being one that we probably are familiar with and we see day-to-day interactions on our roadways. The education campaign, what that will exactly entail, will be developed with a technical advisory group guidance as well, what that's going to be, whether it's going to be education to road users of all types. So it would be for drivers, cyclists, working with other agencies as well that operate on the roadways. More details will come, and we'd love to come back and present that when we have more on it.
Got that harebrained idea. Go ahead.
Omar and then Barry.
Thanks so much for the presentation. As I've seen or noticed more recently, there's been an effort towards EV bikes. Is there an attachment or part of the campaign and education with the benefits of utilizing or purchasing an EV bike? I don't know, is it called EV bike? Am I saying the right? Electrical vehicle bike? As part of this, and also to utilize that instead of gas powered vehicles? Is that part of this campaign and effort?
In a broad sense, the idea is designing and making a roadway network that's safe for everyone. And so if it's safe for somebody who is on a bicycle, on a scooter, in a wheelchair, it's safe for all of us, whether they're behind the wheel of a vehicle in transit. So we want to have a system that's safe regardless of the mode that they choose. And on the education campaign, we want to touch all those bases as well.
Let me just add to that response, though. I think your question was about the promotion of e-bikes as a transportation option. That's
yes, or scooters, like electro scooters, or just
so we have a couple of other related efforts underway. So we're updating the regional active transportation plan. It hasn't been updated in a long time. Back when we did it, there weren't scooters and e-bikes, and there's now an opportunity to include those into the active transportation plan. But we also have an e-bike incentive program that's underway. So it's a loan-to-own program where we are loaning out e-bikes to folks who are willing to track their trips and ride a certain number of miles every month. And if they can commit to doing that over a 2-year period, then they'll own that bike. And so we can come back with more information on that pilot project as well at a future meeting.
Perfect, because a thought was also, as we encourage people to utilize different modes of transportation, then the occurrences of safety, those occurrences of accidents may increase as well. So are we looking forehand or looking into the future to see what that impact may be, right? As our communities become easier to travel within, there's more people on the bike lane, what would that mean in the future as well? So maybe forecasting that as well.
Yeah. Appreciate that. Thank you.
I think we have Barry. No? Okay, Faye, Belen.
Thank you for the presentation. Great work so far. Safety is important. I know this is focused a lot on like highways and roads driving, but I'm wondering if there's also some kind of emphasis on walkability and pedestrian friendliness, like expanding, walkable streets and roads.
I think that will come out of it as far as identifying facilities and different types of facilities that, yes, promote walkability in a way that people feel safe, right? That
Correct.
we not only have the data behind it to demonstrate that there is safety benefits for different types of facility types, but then also the typical user of that facility feels safe navigating and wayfinding, finding their way from where they start to where they want to go.
Yes, thank you. And that's really important as an advocate for public transit, right? So that we can promote mode shifts. So they do bike and they do scooter and maybe they drive their car for part of the way, right? But they're also utilizing the other effective transportation modes. Thank you.
Did you have your hand up, Faye? Okay.
So I was just wondering if part of this grant offers a redesign of the tiny shared spaces between motorists and bikers and walkers, because right now the potential for accidents are really like the tiny shared spaces between those two. So even when I'm driving, I'm so scared to move to the next lane because I see a biker driving in that lane. Is there a potential to redesign the whole infrastructure so there's a clear pathway for walkability and biking separate from driving? Is that part of the grant?
So two parts to that. This grant is focused, this phase of this grant, I should say, is focused just on planning. We're actually not allowed to make design level implementation on this type of grant. Summer of 2024, when we look at the next cycle of opportunities for grants, then we can look at more implementation and that would go from design to construction. So this one, we are looking at more the planning side of things. But what we do want to accomplish is consistency across the network so that users of the transportation system know, okay, when I see this type of facility, this is what's going to happen. And so whether that's a mixing zone where when there isn't capacity to have a separated facility, occasionally we will have those mixing zones of different modes together. But we, as a region, we are tending towards having those separated facilities where possible. We start to see that downtown and many other communities within the region.
Another issue that came to mind is like there are several studies have shown that light is always associated with safety. A well-lit area is more prone to free from any hazards or accidents. So is there also potential to put lighting as part of the planning project?
So lighting is one of the variables that we'll look at with safety data. So, and when I say safety data, we're looking at incidents. So we're looking at historical events, tragic events that have affected people's lives. And in that, we can see where lighting was available, if it was on, and we can start to do the analysis to see where are there gaps. And from there, we could have those action steps to move forward to recommend policies that can advance lighting in more areas and help prioritize where those areas should be. So that's kind of the implementation steps that would come out of this effort.
Rachel?
Thank you so much for this. I think I'm kind of on line with Belen where she was speaking of the walkability and safety, because we already see in some of our communities that sidewalks, they have to walk in the street, which creates hazards for both the pedestrian and the motorist. But wondering where exactly this committee or like the role, I see the planning. There's like community assessment, walkability groups that have already been out there through resident leadership that have been talking to our cities about this, but I think this committee, I want to know kind of what is the advocacy role or in recommendations and how can we move from these plans to actually changing our communities? I want to see kind of, it's great to have the plan, it's great to have the implementation of ideas, but where does it go from there?
So I think the positive step of this is outlining some of the policies and programs that the region could prioritize, and it could go through SANDAG structure
and get some more backing that way, and then also go to local jurisdictions and tribes and other partners to have an identified list of these are the types of things that will have the biggest impact for our region and help save more lives on our roadways, whether that be additional walkability funding or programming or education and outreach, whether it's lighting. It'll help identify where we should invest and focus finite resources.
Other comments?
I will make a comment, and it's about safety. I live 3 miles away from a middle school, and I walk with my dog sometimes in the morning. And middle schoolers with e-bikes use the sidewalk because they don't feel safe because the infrastructure is not there. So I think it's a safety issue because it's hard for, you know, a pedestrian and e-bike to use the same sidewalk. So I think it's something to take into consideration since we are speaking about walkability. And but yes, I see it like almost every day. So I'm trying to avoid that because I know that youth need to get to school. But yes, the infrastructure is not there, so they use the sidewalk because it's safer for them. So we have to share the sidewalk with them.
Yeah, thank you. And you bring up a really good point. And there are changes happening very quickly, and some of the data that we're going to be using for this plan as required is older. Safety data is notoriously about 2 years behind. And if you think about e-bike ownership and how that's changed since even 2020, 2021, it feels like a different place now with the amount of e-bike usage. My son is in middle school, understand the challenges there. So one thing that and Chesley spoke to this earlier, is outreach with the CBOs to better understand what's happening right now. So there's this gap in data and understanding, and we're hoping to get much of this information through that process as well to fill in more timely information where there's areas of additional challenge that hasn't been identified in the data. So that's another key point, and I think that's a great illustration of it. Thank you.
Thank you for the robust conversation. I just have a comment, or I don't know if it's a question, but around, I feel like zoning will be an important part of this conversation. When I think about how land use decisions are being made in jurisdictions, they don't necessarily always align with safety. So for instance, we just are allowing another drive-through in and out, to come into our community. And so that's going to have this ripple effect of safety concerns in this area. And so I wonder if, consideration in this plan is like, how do we influence or support jurisdictions in making decisions that may feel economically beneficial when there's that safety concern, and even information and data for CBOs to be able to come to our representatives and say, hey, here's data that shows making these sort of land use decisions is going to negatively impact safety. And we have data to back up because that's been a challenge that we've experienced.
Thank you for that comment. We'll definitely have the data for that, and we're really excited and chomping at the bit to release this data dashboard where it will have that historic data where we can look back at changes, pre and post implementation or some change, and then publicly accessible, and to be able to dive into deeper understanding of what's happening in one small area or writ large across the region. Interesting on bringing up the zoning and kind of permitting aspect. That's one I hadn't thought of before that I'll work into this planning aspect. Thank you.
I see no other hands, Chair.
Great, thank you. And thanks for the presentation. I know this is actually something a lot that we've been talking about in the city of Carlsbad as well. And I really appreciated some of the questions because definitely those are things that we're discussing in terms of, how do we really make our infrastructure more conducive to the different modes of transit throughout our community and safer, and just ensuring that we have access throughout the community. So thanks for all the questions. I think that that we had a great discussion here, and just want to make sure that we have the opportunity to check in to see if we have any comments from the public as well.
Thank you. There are no public comments on this item.
Okay, great. All right, so thanks. Thank you all for that discussion. I know that now we're moving on to our last item, which is just to check in about any possible topics for the next meeting. And this would just be for either the next meeting or future meetings that weren't mentioned during our previous meeting or today.
And we do have a significant list that you all have shared from the last couple of meetings. So we always want to have it on the agenda, but. Faye, did you have something?
Yes, I think during the last meeting, there was like a white paper that was released on zero vehicle emission. And so I would just like to have a follow-up on that and some discussion around that paper.
Okay.
Another, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, another one too is digital divide, if we can include a discussion on that.
I think, like, for me to not sound repetitive, if we can have the list like for consideration. So if items come up or ideas come up, we don't repeat some of the ideas already been considered for future meetings.
That's a good idea. We'll talk through how we can share that, because as you all have mentioned many different topics, and we're sort of looking through those as we plan out these agendas. But yeah, good suggestion. I don't see any other comments, Chair.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any comments from the public?
There are no public comments.
All right, well, with that, our next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, May 25th, 2023 at 10 a.m. at the SANDAG building at 401 B Street location. Any questions or comments from the working group members before we adjourn? Okay, seeing none. And apologies, you're going to hear my dog barking in the background, but thank you all for coming today, and we are adjourned at 11:21 a.m. Thanks for your time.